We are now on the top of Daf Yud Dalid Omid Beis. Now, the Gemara had quoted our Mishnah as reflecting the Shita of Rabbi Akiva. As rejecting the Shita of Rabbi Akiva. And the reason for that is because since we require Hazah on the Kohen Gadol on a daily basis for the 7 days of quarantine, he, according to Rabbi Akiva, becomes disqualified for the avodah. So how could our Mishnah postulate that on a daily basis during these 7 days, the Kohen Gadol alone does the implementation of the avodah? If he is tameh, he's disqualified. We can reconcile our Mishnah with Rabbi Akiva. How so? How could we engineer it in such a way that there's a daily hazah on the Kohen Gadol and yet he's kosher avodah? And the answer is the Aved Avodah Kuli Yoma. Every day he'll do the avodah from daybreak until dusk, and then lepanya at the end of the day, when the day is about to terminate and he's finished all his avodah, then madu ale. Madu means mazu ale. The dalet replaces the sign. So we do hazah at the end of the day, right before the day ends, before Shkiyas Achama. And then, Vitovim, right after the Hazah, he goes into the mikvah, and V'ovid Harav Shemesh. Now the sun sets, and the Tumah that Rabbi Akiva talks about, that if a person is Maza al Atar, the tar contaminates himself, that's only a Tumas Erev, which means it's a day Tumah, which only requires Harav Shemesh. By the time he gets to Harav Shemesh, he's already had not only the Azor, by which he contracted Tumah, but he also had Tefillah in a mikvah, and now he had Harav Shemesh. So he's perfectly tar, and he can wake up the next morning and do the Avodah. This rotation is going to repeat itself for 7 days. Now we get back to our Mishnah, and we noticed in our Mishnah that in the sequence, the Aktaras comes first, and then the Atovas Haneros. Alma, we derive from this, says the Gemara, that Ktoris Bereisha v'Hadar Neros, that in the daily sequence of the Seder Avoda, which you may recall is something that we mentioned in the name of Abaye on a daily basis at the end of Karbanos, and in that sequence, we're going to have to insist that the Ktoris come before the Atovas Haneros if we want to maintain our Mishnah, Alma Ktoris Bereisha v'Hadar Neros. We're going to find a contradiction in a Mishnah in Masechet Tamid. And the Mishnah in Masechet Tamid is talking about the pious, the daily lottery, by which they divvied up the avodah of that day to the Anshe Beis Av, which Kohen would get which avodah depend upon how successful he was in the lottery. And the Mishnah in Tamid says, Misha Zocha b'Dishun, and we're talking now first and foremost, even before daybreak, with Dishon Mizbeach HaPnimi, which means that whatever was left from the Torres on the previous day inside the Heichal, in the Mizbeach HaZav, that had to be cleaned off, and that was the first pious, the first lottery of the day. And the lottery was done in sequence, reflecting the sequence of the Avodah. Next we go to Misha Zocha b'Menorah. Who gets to do the Atovas HaMenorah? And then finally, Misha Zacha b'Ktores. So you see clearly from this Mishnah, the sequence in Tamid indicates that the avodah of the Ktores comes last. First, we have the menorah, and that's the flip side of our Mishnah. Rav Huna Man Tana Tamid, who is the author of Masechet Tamid, meaning that Masechet Tamid reflects consistently the sheet of one particular Tana. Who is that Tana who could be considered the author of Masechet Tamid? Says Rav Huna, Rabbi Shimon Isha Mitzpahu. Rabbi Shimon, who came from a location called Mitzpah. And Rav Huna is of the opinion that we're going to find that our Mishnah is not reflecting the Mishnah in Tamid, because the Mishnah in Tamid is attributed to Rab Shimon Ish HaMitzvah. And his opinion was that the menorah comes before the Ketores. But our Mishnah represents the view of most of the Chacham and most of the Tanoim against the singular view and dissension of Rabbi Shimon. And our Mishnah reflects the opinion that, on the contrary, the Ketores comes before the menorah. That which we see in Mishnah Tamid, that the menorah comes before the Ketores on a daily basis, that reflects the Shita of Rav Shimon Ish HaMitzvah. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, Rav Huna, you're giving us only a partial view. If you know all the opinions of Rav Shimon, you will see that there's no way that we can reconcile the Mishnayos of Tamid with his Shita. So although you may have lucked out in one occasion and you found that there's one particular Mishnah in Tamid that can be reconciled with Rav Shimon, but if you look at the overview, you will see that it's irreconcilable. We can never attribute the Mishnayos in Tamid to Rav Shimon. And why not? Tisnan, let's take a look at the Mishnah in Tamid, and we'll see that the Mishnah records the Shita of the Chachamim, and then the dissenting view will determine that of Reb Shimon Ish HaMitzvah, rejecting that of the Chachamim, as reflected in the Mishnah in Tamid. So you cannot say that the Mishnah in Tamid is authored by Reb Shimon. And this has to do with the carbon Tamid, specifically with the dam of the carbon Tamid and its zrika. And the carbon Tamid is a carbon ola. And with regard to carbon ola, the principle that underlies the entire avoda of the zrika sadam of a carbon ola is what's called shtayim shein arba, which means that the zrika is done only on two corners of the mizbeach, but those two corners are on right angles, in such a way that the dam will fall on both sides. So in effect, you've covered all four sides of the mizbeach, and that's called shtayim shein arba. And how do you set up the shtayim shein arba in the case of the carbon tamid as a typical example of a carbon ola? Balo, the Kohen begins with Keren Mizrachis. Now keep in mind that the Mizrach is the entranceway into the Beis HaMikdash. When you go into the Beis HaMikdash, you're going from Mizrach to Marav until you get to the Kodesh Kodashim, which is on the Marav. And if you turn to your right, you're turning north. If you turn to your left, you're turning south. So first he begins with the Zrika on the Mizrachis Sfonis, which means at the entranceway into the Mizbeach, which is Mizrach, he immediately turns right towards the northeast, and then Nosein Mizracha Sfona, and he puts the dam there on the northeastern corner of the Mizbeach. What does he do next? Next, he walks around the Mizbeach. He's now going from east to west. Then he turns to the left, and he's going from west to north, to south, right? Because the right side is the north, and the left side is the south. And that's called Maravis Dromis, west. And now he's turning to his left, and he's going south. No saying Marava Drom. And this Mishnah basically reflects the opinion that the carbon tamid is no different than any carbon ola. And the overruling principle, the ruling principle is Shtayim Shein Arba. So by placing the dam on Svonis Mizrachis, he's now covered both the Ksafon and the Mizrach. And then when he goes diagonally, again, he's going to circle the Mizbeach, but he gets to the diagonal, and now he's on the southwest side. Now he covers both the south and the west. So he's covered all four sides of the Mizbeach with two Zrikos, otherwise known as Matanos, Matan Dom. However, Tani Allah, we have a brisa that records a dissenting view of Rabbi Shimon Ish HaMitzvah. And he says, Meshana b'tamid, that I'm going to prove to you from the psukim in the Torah that tamid is different than every carbon olam. And in a certain sense, the carbon tamid is similar to a carbon chatos. And a carbon chatos requires a zrika on all four sides of the mizbech. So the carbon tamid is going to be some sort of a hybrid, according to Reb Shimon, of a carbon ola and a carbon chatos. And therefore, what happens? He starts on Mizrachis Tzfonis. Here, Reb Shimon is just like the Chacham, identical. He turns from his east towards the north. But then, Maravis Dromis. And now, what he does is when he circles the Mizbeach, he is moving west and he's on the south side. Then, what he does is two different zrikos. No Saint Marava. He puts them on the western side. That's one matana. So we're up to the second matana. Then he turns left towards the southern side. No Saint Droma, and he adds another zrika on the southern side. So all told, he's got three zrikos. In any event, it's quite clear that the Mishnah in Tamid does not reflect the opinion of Reb Shimon Ish HaMitzvah, and therefore we cannot attribute the Mishnayos in Tamid to Reb Shimon Ish Mitzvah. And the Gemara is telling us that unfortunately Rav Huna missed that point. Elam Rabbi Yochanan, therefore we're going to say it the other way around. Mantana Seder Yoma, Reb Shimon Ish HaMitzvah. Our Mishnah in Masechet Yoma that has the Ketores before the menorah, that Mishnah reflects the Shita of Rabbi Shimon Ish HaMitzvah. However, with regard to the Mishnayos in Tamid, that reflects the dissenting view of the Chachamim, and they are of the opinion, as we saw in the Mishnah in Tamid, with regard to the Payis, that Hatovas Haneros comes before Haktoras Haktoras. Now, Varami Seder Yoma, Seder Yoma. The Gemara says, wait a minute. Even within Masechet Yoma itself, we're going to have a contradiction from our Mishnah to a later Mishnah in Masechet Yoma. Why? The Snan we have later on in the Mishnah in Masechet Yoma, which is on Daf Chaf Hey. Payis Hasheni, Mishoche. So we're finished with the Deshen. Now we're up to the second lottery, and that's for the Shechita of the Carbon Tamid. Mizore. And then we go on and we determine who will get the Zrika Sadam. Mi b'dashen mizbeach hapnimi, umi b'dashen es hamenorah. So now we have, after Dishin mizbeach hapnimi, we have the Dishin of the menorah, and then umi male evarim lakevesh, who's going to be in charge of burning the emurim of the Tamid. And then in the following Mishnah it says Payis Hashlishi. The third round is Chadoshim Liktoros Bo Ve'Fisa. They made an announcement that if you have not yet got the opportunity this year to bring the Ketores, come and participate in the lottery. And amongst those who are looking for their first round, their first opportunity to do the Ketores, there will be a lottery to determine which one will actually do the Ketores. But we see clearly in this Mishnah later on that the Neros comes before the Ketores. In our Mishnah, we have the Ketores first and the Neros second. So we now are stuck with a contradiction within Masechet Yoma from one Mishnah to the other. Rabbi Lo Kasha. Now, in order to appreciate Abai's reconciliation, let's introduce the following. The Hatovas Haneros was done in two stages. There are all told 7 candles, but we light, or Hatova means prepare, 5. Then we take a break with an interruption. We'll see what happens during that interruption. And then the last 2 Neros. So therefore, our Mishnah, says Abai, is Kan Tovas shtei neros. When our Mishnah says that the neros come after the Ketores, it's a reference to the last two neros. So you have the first five, and they're going to be first on the list. And that's why in the Mishnah later on in Masechet Yoma, we're going to have the neros first. That's a reference to the five neros that come first. And then we're going to have the Ketores, and the Ketores is going to be wedged between the five neros and the last two neros. And therefore, when our Mishnah speaks about Hatava, it's talking about the last two neros. And they will come, in fact, after the Ketores. But Khan, the later Mishnah Daf Chafei, and the one after that, is B'Hatavas Chamesh neros. And Hatavas HaNeros really comes first. That's why it says in the sequence of the pious, Mi Midashen Es HaMenorah, that's Hatavas HaNeros, to clean off the ashes from the menorah. And then Mi Chadashim L'Ketoras Bo Vehefisu, the pious of the Ketores afterwards, because we're after the five neros. So Abaye has a perfect reconciliation of the two Mishnayos in Masechet Yoma. Now the Gemara says as follows: L'meimra de Ketores mafsiklu. Are you going to assume, Abaye, that in this interruption in Hatavas HaNeros, when we wedge a certain avoda in between Hatavas five neros and the final two neros, it's going to be the Ketores? Wait a minute, Abaye, you yourself are the famous Abaye, as I said before, that we recite daily in the Karbanos. Abaye Mesader Marocha Bishmei the Gemara. Abaye himself formulated and presented the sequence of the avoda, and dam hatavid mafsikluhu, the way that Abaye records this sequence, the interruption between the first five neros and the last two neros is not the Ketores, but rather the Tamid, meaning the Shechita, the Tamid, and all the avodas leading up to the Zrika, they took place early in the morning. But a little bit later on, we were ready for the Haktoras HaMurim, when we took the limbs of the Tamid and we burnt them on the Mizbeach. And the burning of the limbs of the Tamid on the Mizbeach was the avoda that Abaye singles out as serving as an interruption between the five neros and the two neros. No indication that it was the Ketores that was meant to separate and interrupt between the five and the two. Amri Lokash. Ahili Abba Shaul. Chol L'Rabbon. When Abaye gives us the Seder HaMarocha, the Seder Avoda on a daily basis, he gives it to us, and he says it explicitly, that the Seder Yoma is Haliba the Abba Shaul. Whereas our Mishnah is not Abba Shaul. Our Mishnah reflects the sheet of the Bar Plukta, those who dissent against Abba Shaul, namely the Rabbanah. And it seems like the tradition had it that according to Abba Shaul, the mafsik that would interrupt and wedge between the five neros and the two neros was the Dam HaTamid. And our Mishnah, on the other hand, reflects the sheet of the Chachamim. They never accept that. They think that the Ketores comes between the five neros and the last two neros. The Sanya we learned in a Brisa, Lo yetev es haneros v'achakach yaktir, el yaktir v'achakach yetev. And this is a reference, apparently, to the last two neros. And the Brisa is teaching us, in the name of the Chachamim, that Aktoras must precede the Atava of the last two neros. Whereas Abba Shaul, Omer, the Brisa now records the dissenting view of Abba Shaul, Meitiv the Achakach Maktir, which means that we complete the entire process of Hatovas Haneros, and only then do we go on to Haktoras, Haktores. So the Haktoras comes after the Haktoras Haneros, which would reflect what we saw in the Mishnah in Talmud in terms of the pious, that the menorah comes before the Ketores. And that which Abai says, that the Ketores is left till after the Hatova, the complete Hatova, even the last two, and the interruption between 5 and 2 is the Talmud, that reflects the Shita of Abba Shaul. My time at Abba Shaul, from whence does Abba Shaul derive his conclusion, his opinion, that the Tovas Haneros comes before the Aktoras Aktores? It says, Baboker Beitivos Haneros, Vahada Yaktirena. The word Yaktirena, according to Abba Shaul, is a reference to the Ketores. Yaktirena is the verb, Ketores is the noun. And yet, with regard to the Neros at the beginning of this pasuk, it says Baboker, which means early in the morning, Baboker, very early in the morning. And therefore, the Torah is teaching us, with regard to both sets of Hatava, whether it's the first 5 or the last 2, they should both come earlier than Aktoras Aktoras. How do the Rabbanan deal with the pasuk itself, which says Baboker, Baboker, indicating that the Ketores comes at the end after Hatovas Haneros, and here we turn to Daf Tes Vav and Aleph. Be'idon Hatava Tehe Maktir Ketores. All it means is that during this period of time of Neros, then we're ready for the Ketores. But it's only after we finish Hatovas Haneros, only then are we ready for. No, I'm sorry, just the opposite. We're going now according to the Chachamim. So Bishleim, according to Abba Shaul was the one who said Meitiv, the Achakach Maktir, the Aktoras comes after the Neros. So then we understand Baboker. Now, according to Chachamim, we said according to the Chachamim Shita, Be'idan Hatova Tehei Maktir Ketores means that within that period of time called Hatovas Haneros, there's going to be Aktoras. So you have bookends. You begin Hatovas Haneros with 5, you end with the other 2, totaling 7, and within that time, the Rabbanan hold Yaktirena, you're going to be Maktir the Ketores. So the Ketores comes wedged in between. And now the Gemara is going to go ahead and try to prove this and support this interpretation of the pasuk. Is Bein Arbayim Tichsiv, with regard to the service of the Mizbeach in the afternoon, the Avod in the afternoon, it says Balos Aaron Saneros Bein Arbayim Yaktirena. And the word Yaktirena indicates that the Aktoras came after the Neros. Hachinami, we have no choice but to assume that Bereisha Madlik Neros, Bahadar Maktir Ketores Shel Ben Arbayim. And it must be that we begin the process of Hadlokas Hadneros, and then we are Maktir the Ketores of Ben Arbayim somewhere during the course of this avoda of Hatovas of Hatoras Haneros. And this concept on the top of Daf Tes Vav, Be'idon Hatova, Tehei Miktar Ketores, means that when you're preparing the last two candles, last two lamps, the Ketores, the cloud, the anan of the Ketores that had been offered previously is rising up from the Mizbeach. So obviously he burnt the Ketores before he got to the last two Neros. And the Gemara now is going to prove from the Haktorah of the Ketores Bein Arbayim that it means that, what are you're going to tell me that first you madlik the Neros and then you makdir the Ketores? That's impossible. And the Gemara is going to now embark on a proof and force to reinterpret and come to the conclusion of Be'idon HaTova Tehei Makdir Ketores. So that principle of Be'idon HaKtorah, Be'idon HaTova Tehei Makdir Ketores is going to be proven, and that's what we'll do in Mir Shem tomorrow's daf from the pasuk referring to the Tamid Shel Bein Arbayim, and to be more specifically to that Tavas HaNeros of Bein Arbayim. So that's a Mir Hashem going to be the subject of tomorrow.